Well, hello. I am Richard Carrier, PhD in ancient history from Columbia University. I do this for a living, talking about ancient history and the origins of Christianity and other things related to that. If you want to know anything about me, all my stuff is at richardcarrier.info. That's richardcarrier.info.
It shocks some people to hear that Jesus never existed. Even people who don't believe that he was a deity or a quasi-deity,
Yeah.
they think that there was an earthly Jesus, a human Jesus. There's a lot to talk about on this subject. Let's start with why the character Jesus was given an earthly history.
Yeah. So obviously it's plausible that there was a historical Jesus. But what I found when I conducted my study on this was that it looks like there wasn't. And when you look at the earlier texts, what you see is like Paul, for example, in his authentic letters, he's talking to this revelatory being that he only knows information about through hidden messages in scripture and revelations, visions, whether they're dreams or hallucinations, whichever. He's not specific as to that. He doesn't seem to know about a Jesus who had a ministry. He doesn't seem to know about Jesus who performed miracles, Jesus who did anything in life. Like all of his writings, it's only space Jesus, right? It's only a Jesus in outer space, essentially. And it's only when you get to the Gospels, and even like we have another author, First Clement. It's the same thing. Like how do you learn about what Jesus said? Well, you go to read the scriptures and you find hidden messages in there, or you have visions, revelations. There's no historical Jesus in First Clement either, and that's also what we call before the Jewish War, which is before the end of the 60s AD. 70 AD, the Jewish temple was destroyed. Now, after that, there was kind of a crisis of faith, essentially, and both among the Jews and the Christians. And the Christians were basically a sect of Jews. They saw themselves as sort of the successors to the Jews. But the thing is like the end of the world was supposed to come. Yeah, they expected the temple to be destroyed. They expected Jerusalem to be destroyed. They expected all the bad Jews to be killed and all the good Jews to be saved. Well, that happened. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. And then nothing happened. Like no one was resurrected. No one was ascended. The end of the world. The world didn't end, right? So the question that they were facing at that time, and this is when you think Mark, the Gospel of Mark is probably the first written, probably towards the end of the 70s. And they're dealing with this crisis. Like, how do we explain, okay, the end, we thought the end was going to come anytime now. This catastrophe happens and it still hasn't ended. What do we do? And so I think the Gospel of Mark was first written to sort of reboot Christianity in this environment and sort of explain why that happened and the world hadn't ended yet. And also what the teachings of the church should be. Like, what kind of person should you be? What is the message of the gospel? How are you saved, etc.? And so he wrote this sort of fable with Jesus as the main character, where Jesus goes around telling parables, getting into things, doing things, and so on. But every scene is meant to communicate something about the gospel, and it is structured around this idea of how do we explain why the world hasn't ended yet, we're supposed to be saved, what does being saved mean, etc. And I think that's the main reason why we get the first stories putting Jesus in history. So they have him walking around talking to people, in some cases historical people like Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas, in order to convey messages that they wanted to convey about the faith. But this idea of putting Jesus on earth in our earth history appears to have been Mark's innovation. Like we don't have any evidence of this ever being the case. In First Clement and Paul, the authentic letters of Paul, even First Peter, which is an epistle that some scholars think is forged, it might be authentic, but if it's authentic, it also has no knowledge. And this is Peter, supposedly, the right-hand man to Jesus. When he explains the crucifixion, where does he get all his information from? Well, Scripture. He found it in hidden messages in Scripture. Like, he has no eyewitness testimony. Like, there's nothing about, I met Jesus, and this is what he said, this is why he inspired me. No, it's just all secret messages in Scripture and Revelation and things like that. So all the earlier texts look like this, and then, boom, Mark comes out with this. And, of course, Mark has his ideas, right? And there are other communities that didn't like those ideas, right? So what they wanted to do is rewrite the story, do the same thing he did, but better from their point of view, right? So if you think of Matthew, so Mark is writing for a Gentile community. He's writing for the churches that Paul created, and a lot of Mark is built out of the letters of Paul. He takes things that Paul said and turns them into stories about Jesus or things Jesus said. But the thing with Paul is he said that Gentiles could join the church without converting to Judaism. So they didn't need to cut off a little piece of their penis. They didn't need to follow the dietary rules. Like, it's very arduous to be Jewish. He made it easy. He says, you don't follow any of those rules. Just here's some basic commandments, and that's it. You can just follow those, which made it very popular. So a lot of Gentiles came in. And so Mark is writing for that group. Matthew, however, whoever he was, is writing for the Jewish Christians, the Christians who still thought you had to convert, fully convert. You had to be Jewish all the way, kosher and everything, to be a Christian. So Matthew looks at Mark's gospel and says, oh, crap, that's a really good story. We're going to lose this propaganda war. We need to co-opt that story. And so what he did is he literally borrowed it almost verbatim, almost most of Mark verbatim, and then added a bunch of stuff that pushes this Jewish agenda and this Jewish Christian agenda. And then and of course they sell their gospel as the original gospel, right? And then trying to make it seem like Mark is the knockoff when it really wasn't. Now you get Luke comes along. Now Luke is a Gentile, but he sees this conflict in the church between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, and he wants to resolve the conflict. He wants them to get along. And so Luke comes up with this gospel about how all the Jews and the Gentiles can get along. And it's the gospel and the book of Acts, and it's all about that. And so he steers the sort of the attacks on the Jews towards the attacks on the elite, which was always the case. It was never like Mark was not anti-Semitic. Mark was critical of the Jewish elite. Matthew is also critical of the Jewish elite, and he's fully Jewish. Luke is critical of the Jewish elite, but he's really pushing that idea that, you know what, the Jews aren't bad guys, except the elites, these guys in charge. Like, they're the ones that, we got to get rid of them, and then everybody else is cool. And the Romans are cool. That's the other thing, is Luke's very big on the Romans are cool too. They're not really a big problem. And so that's Luke, right? So he's rewritten the story to do this. And then, we're looking about 100 years later, John comes along. Now, John's complicated because our Gospel of John is the second redaction of the original Gospel. We don't have it. The original Gospel, that's one thing. And then someone came along and rewrote it. That's another thing. And then someone came along and rewrote that, and that's the one we have. And so John has a very different perspective. John's perspective is, well, it's 100 years later, we kind of have to retool this religion to suit the current circumstances. And that's what but then, of course, he sells his gospel as the original gospel, etc., to supersede all the others. And so that's how the Gospels got written. There was this propaganda war about who controls the narrative of Jesus, putting him in history to sell these ideas. It was all about selling the ideas, not really about telling the truth, the historical truth about Jesus. That's not what they cared about. They wanted the message was more important to them.
I didn't know until I read your book that it was not rare to give a deity in earthly history. Could you talk about the term for that and what?
Yeah. So it's called Euhemerism, and there's two different ways to become a god. There are two different ways to define a god back then. One was for a mortal to be a god. One was deification, which is you're an actual historical person, like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, or even Emperor Hadrian's lover, Antinos. So Antinos was his lover, and he kind of deified him too. So, like, if you were a human and you got deified, like were just declared, oh, they went to heaven, now they're a god. They've got a new body and they're all powerful, etc. That's deification. But there was another way to have a mortal become a god, which is you start with the celestial god, like Zeus. Zeus was always a celestial god. He lived on a mountain, but he was a space god essentially. And then, this guy, Euhemeris, this author, comes along and he writes a story saying, oh, no. Zeus was just like these other deified guys. He was a normal human king on Earth who was deified. Like, he was just a regular guy and he got deified. Now, that's completely bogus and made up. Like, Zeus was always a celestial. There was never a historical Zeus. But Euhemeris came up with this idea, and we don't really have Euhemeris's books. We have people talking about it and quoting it. And so we don't really know, was he making fun of religion? Did he have an agenda? We're not sure. But what he did became really popular for all kinds of different people. So, like, there were the rationalists who wanted to make gods make sense and said, oh, this is a great way to make gods make sense. They were all historical people who became gods. So they had all these non-historical people now suddenly become historical people because it's a great way to explain the gods. But then you have the religious people who also found this very valuable. And the one example we have, we're really lucky to have this, is there's an author roughly around 100 AD by the name of Plutarch. And he wrote this book. He wrote it to a priestess of Isis, so someone who was in the know. And he wrote this book, like, this is everything I've learned about your religion, right? Like Osiris called, Isis called, etc. The book is called On Isis and Osiris. And he wrote this whole book. And in the process of that book, he's going through all these explanations. Like, some people think the gods are real, some people think that they're just metaphors for elements. Some people think this, some people think that. And he goes over the Euhemeris model, and he says, he mentions that, like the idea that there used to be kings, like Osiris would be a pharaoh, and then he became a thing. And Plutarch is aware that the stories told of Osiris say that. Like, they had the biographies of Osiris, he was an ancient pharaoh, he was deified and elevated and became a god, right? And but Plutarch says, no. That's for the rabble. That's for the common people to understand. For if you go talk to a priest, now mind you, he's writing this to a priestess who knows this, right? So he can't like be wrong about this. Essentially, he says if you talk to a priest, like the insiders say, no, these are basically space aliens. Like, they don't use that word in English, but they talk about essentially these are entities that live in space. And they descended just below the moon into the what's called the firmament, or the air, which is the atmosphere, which is where a lot of demonic activity occurs, and became mortal briefly there, and were killed by Typhon, the equivalent of Satan in their system, and then resurrected, and this is Osiris, resurrected and went back up and became the supreme deity. So he went up, he didn't go down to the common people believe he goes down below to deal with the dead in the graves. No, actually, the real view is he's above the moon. He's a super celestial. But he did come down. He did become mortal, and he did die. He was killed, but he did rise again into a superior body and went up. But Plutarch says all this took place in outer space or in the atmosphere. Like, it never happened here. It was not a historical event. It wasn't a real pharaoh. It wasn't anything like that. And he says that's what the insiders learn. And then the story that puts him on Earth is just for the outsiders and for the lower ranking people, like, because that's the most that they can understand. Like, you can tell you the story, we can teach you the teachings of the religion with this vehicle, you'll understand that, but this highfalutin space stuff, you won't get it. Like, you got to be educated and superior for that. And that's what Plutarch tells us, right? And so once we see that, we think, well, actually that makes a lot of sense of Christianity too, right? Because we're looking at Paul, First Clement, we're seeing space Jesus, and then suddenly a few decades later we got the Gospels, and he's on Earth, just the equivalent of a historical pharaoh, except in this case he's a rabbi, a sage, or whatever. It's the same thing. For the outsiders, it's the literal truth of him walking around Galilee. For the elite who, are attuned and whatnot, for them, it's all allegory for deeper truths about reality. So that, I think, is how the Christian story came that way. And we like I said, we have the example of the Osiris cult doing the same thing. And Egypt, where this cult originated, although the cult was practiced and preached everywhere in the Mediterranean, so it wasn't just Egypt. But Egypt is right next to Palestine, right? So, and we know there's huge communities of Jews in Egypt at this time. And we know they traveled back and forth. So the ideas were certainly flowing around. And I think that's what happened as Christianity evolved and developed.
The New Testament was written as myth, not as history. There are some believers who think that the Bible is history. Could you talk about the difference between myth and history?
Yeah. So there's two different things. So even in antiquity, now to say like modern history is way more methodological, way more advanced, more scientific. But even in antiquity, they understood the difference between myth and history. To the point that even historians, when they tell a myth, they'll say, I'm telling a myth. Like Josephus does this. I'm going to tell you a myth. And then he tells you a story in the midst of his history, right? So he wants to demarcate these things. They knew these were different things. Histories tended to be critical in the sense that they would talk about their sources, why you should trust them, or they would talk about multiple accounts of the same event and which one to believe in, or they would say, I'm not really sure this story is true, but this is what I heard. In other words, you get this critical mindset, this idea of like, I'm concerned about what's true and I want to convey to you as much as possible, like my sense of what's true or not. And the contents are more basically mundane and realistic, right? Like they're things that normally happen. They're ordinary wars, ordinary dramas, and things like that. But when you get to myth, it's very different. So myth, they're not really so much concerned with talking about sources. They're definitely not going to talk about multiple different versions and which one you should believe. They're going to tell you the story just as they want you to believe it, as if that's just the story and you should just believe it. And there's no skepticism. There's no critical approach to it. The other half of it, of myth, is that they're not so much interested in mundane, realistic stuff. They're mostly going to be fabulous. And this is true. Like people normally think like, well, it's not, they think myth is just the supernatural. Like, oh, if it doesn't have the supernatural, then it's not mythical. But that's not true, because you can have wildly fabulous, unrealistic things that are not supernatural, like unrealistic human behaviors or, unbelievable coincidences and things like that we see in realistic novels, nonetheless, that have these things that happen, and we know, oh, that would never happen in the real world. And a classic example is when Mark has Jesus. So they have Peter and his brothers are just fishing, like working, right, for the family, earning. And this guy just walks up. He has no reputation. Never heard of this guy. He just walks up and speaks 2 sentences to them, and they literally ditch their jobs, their capital, their equipment, their families, and walk off with this guy. And that's a great story, right? That's really amazing. Like, sounds great in fiction, but in reality, that would never happen, right? Like, they would take weeks of convincing these guys. Like, that just wouldn't happen, right? So that's an example of something. It's not supernatural. That's not a miracle. It's just so unrealistic that we know that that's a fable, right? That's how you can tell. So myths are full of these fabulous, essentially. And then there's another thing that's different, which is histories are about explaining things. Like, why did these things happen, right? They're interested in explaining how we ended up where we are, or where this particular city-state came from, or how it survived its struggles, and so on. Myth is interested in conveying values and telling you deeper truths about reality, right? So it's bigger stories. And I'll give you an example that pulls all of this together. And this is my favorite one, which is when Jesus, and this is in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus goes up to the fig tree, right? And there's this fig tree. Now, Mark, the author, goes out of his way to tell us that it's not the season for figs, right? He goes out of his way to say that. But Jesus gets angry that there's no figs. And then he curses it, may you never bear fruit again. And then they come back the day later and it's been withered to its very roots, right? And then Jesus has a speech he gives over this. Now, of course, even if Jesus had the super X-Man power of withering fig trees, it would still be insane to curse a fig tree for not bearing fruit when it wasn't even the season for fruit, right? So this story is weird. It's definitely, that's the example of a myth, right? It's definitely weird. Now the clue, and this is what's different between myth and history, the clue to this is when you realize that the fig tree story is wrapped around another story, which is a very famous story, which is where Jesus clears the temple. He goes into the temple, he gets outraged at the money changers, overturns the tables, and curses everybody, etc. So what happens is Jesus finds the fig tree, curses it. He curses it for not bearing fruit out of season. Then he goes to the temple and says, oh, it says corrupt, a den of thieves, etc. And then the next day they go to the fig tree, and the fig tree is withered to its very roots. And Jesus gives a speech about, oh, this is how you're saved now, and particularly through prayer and things like this. And there are various scholars who've noted this. R.G. Hamilton Kelly is one who did a really good analysis of this, showing that these stories are related. They're commenting on each other. There's a lot of this in Mark. It's called ring structure, where you have one story is wrapped around another. And that's on purpose. The outer story is informing the inner story, and the inner story is informing the outer story. And to unlock all of this, you realize that the fig tree it's symbolic. It represents the temple cult itself. So this entire thing, this entire fable, is an explanation for why God destroyed the temple, but didn't end the world. He kept the world going, but he did go out of the way to let heathens destroy the temple. And the reason is it's no longer the season for figs. It's no longer the season for that cult to bear fruit. Now it's been replaced with prayer and Christianity and the gospel, etc. And so that's all. It's all about why God let the temple be destroyed. He says, I found it was corrupt. It was time to get rid of it. Its season has ended. And now a new season has begun, a new religion, etc. So the whole story is, of course, doesn't make any sense as history, right? But it makes beautiful sense as a fable, right? It's something that tells you something about the story. And that's when you see a story like a whole biography that is just full of that. That's a myth. Right. As history, it's more about trying to get the facts right and to explain things and so on. There's less of this in there. There's some of it, but there's less of this. Myth is full of this and has very little of the historical plausibility stuff. And that's how you tell the difference between myth and history, even in the ancient context.
Another thing I discovered through your books is that if Jesus caused trouble in that market, he might have been killed. Could you talk about that?
Oh, okay, yes, this gets to another aspect, another question of myth, which is the implausibility, right? The scenes don't make any sense as history. So, yeah, when Jesus goes... So people don't really understand, and we found inscriptions from the temple that discuss the fact that the temple had an armed guard. There was a whole battalion of soldiers there, Jewish soldiers, with the purpose that if anybody committed desecration of the temple, they would just kill you. And like there's a death penalty warning, like you will be killed if you like fuck with the temple or whatever. So no, there's no way like a real guy could go in there and start knocking over things. Like they would be dead within minutes, right? So this has led some historians to speculate that, oh, this is sort of a whitewashed version of Jesus actually went in with armed soldiers and was attacking the temple. And it kind of got whitewashed into him just turning over a few tables. Like that's ridiculous, right? But they're trying to make it plausible. So I understand their motive, right? Like they like, it doesn't make any sense as written. But you could go the other direction and say, well, it just never happened at all, right? Like the whole story is just a made up fable to illustrate a lesson about the temple cult and why it no longer exists and why the world keeps going on without it. So no, you don't need to resort to these elaborate contraptions to come up with like Jesus the zealot warrior with army that assaulted the temple. But you're right, yeah, when you put the context in of what was actually going on there, the story of Jesus clearing the temple itself, by itself, doesn't make any sense either.
I always thought Jesus saying give to Caesar what is Caesar's is a little rich because churches don't pay taxes.
These days they don't.
No. In the past they did.
So here's the thing. So first of all, that story is an example of Mark reifying something Paul said, not Jesus. So Paul, in Romans 13, Paul has this whole elaborate thing trying to explain to people. Basically, he spends a whole chapter in one of his letters arguing, no, okay, you got to obey the law, you got to pay your taxes, you got to follow your leaders and stuff, don't make trouble. But the curious thing is that in that whole, he's arguing this in this whole chapter, he never thinks to say, remember when Jesus said, yeah, so this idea of that Jesus having this pithy saying obviously didn't exist. Like Paul had never heard of it, no one had ever heard of it, it wasn't a thing. But what Mark did is he read Romans 13 and he said, okay, I need to depict this in a story. And this is a thing that people that got to the level of what's called compositional Greek in that time, like in the school system of that time. And I've written a book about this, which is on ancient education, which is science education in the early Roman Empire, but I have sections on the whole education system. And it's just like this. When you get to this point of composition, they teach you to do this. They teach you, here's like the moral lesson we want you to teach. We want you to write a fictional story that conveys the lesson, right? So they were taught to do this. And so he comes up with the taxing Caesar. This is a very pithy, clever thing, but it's Mark's cleverness, right? But it's all to capture in a story the lesson that Paul was teaching. Now, here's the context that people often don't know, is that when the Jewish temple was destroyed, there had been a temple tax that Jews are expected to, all loyal Jews are expected to pay like a shekel or whatever a year to the temple and it maintain the temple. Okay. So the Romans come in, destroy the temple. Well, there's no temple to tax anyone anymore. So what the Romans did to punish the Jews for rebellion is that tax with all people who wanted to maintain themselves as Jews, which meant that they were covered under a license to practice Judaism. They were allowed to assemble as Jews and practice their religion. If you wanted to claim that, you had to pay a tax, and that temple tax, it went to Rome, basically. It paid for, I think it was paid for the temple of Jupiter. I can't remember what he assigned the tax to, but it went to Rome, right, basically. So this was a big controversy. This comes up in Revelation. This idea of the temple tax comes up in sort of symbolic ways in Revelation, but they're a bit outraged by this idea. So yeah, technically, if you were to be a Jewish Christian, you had to keep paying this tax. And so this was a big issue of like, okay, look, this was supposed to be the temple tax, and you're paying it to these heathen Romans. Like, aren't you abandoning God now? Isn't this, whatever? Now, Mark's writing for a largely Gentile audience, but so his idea is like, don't worry about it. Like, it doesn't matter. It's their money anyway, right? Like, it's irrelevant. So that's what he has. That's his version of it. And so that's where this starts, this mythology of but it's related to this argument, should you pay the temple tax to Rome anymore, or should you be a tax evader, or more catastrophic is no longer claim to be Jewish, but claim to be Christian to avoid the tax, right? So that was the issue that was looming large, and Mark doesn't want to create waves over this, so he creates this sort of narrative. Hey, Jesus said it's okay to pay that tax. Don't worry about it. It's their money anyway. We don't care. Mark doesn't say this, but their view is it's all going to be melted. The whole world's going to be melted in a few years anyway. Don't worry about it, right? Which gets to the whole idea of how Mark kicked that can down the road with the one generation thing, right? Because Mark has Jesus say, this generation will not pass away before I destroy the world, essentially. So that allows the clock to last until the last person from his time is alive. So Mark was able to move the can. It's still near. It could happen any time now, but it's not the end destruction of the temple is not it. But it's going to come still can come any time now. And then you get all the way can kicking. You get all the way to John, the final redaction of John, where he has Jesus literally say to a member of his generation, what is it to you whether I let him live until the end times, right? Meaning that now he can keep one person from that generation alive as long as he wants, and therefore the clock can be any time, right? So this idea of kicking the can down, this is for the apocalypse, right? Mark is doing that too. And this whole temple tax thing and all of that is all related to the Jewish war. It's all a response to that, and trying to deal with that and trying to explain away the fact that the world didn't end yet, but it's going to end, trust us, anytime now, was the idea.
If I've read this correctly in your work, I never read it anywhere else. What people think of as the New Testament is actually a later testament. There was an earlier New Testament.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
I'm astonished you hadn't encountered that. It's funny because that's literally the most mainstream thing within our field.
I'm very sheltered.
Yeah. Well, it's an example. Even Bart Ehrman points this out in his book, Jesus Interrupted, that there are so many things that priests, anybody who's been through seminary, anybody who's been through theology school, things that they know and they all agree is true, but they would never tell their congregations, right? It would never come out of the pulpit or whatever, because it's problematic, right? And this is one of the examples. This is one of those things. So there wasn't any New Testament in the sense of a book, a collection of books, right? There's scattered letters, scattered books, and manuals and things like that. But no one had put them together like in a single set and like, this is our teachings in one set. Kind of equivalent to the Torah. Like, this is our Torah, basically. Until Marcion. So Marcion is early 2nd century. And he has some very radical ideas. Definitely, like, in some ways he's closer to Paul than Orthodoxists. In other ways he's more distant because he's like really changed some of the teachings of the thing. But he comes up with collecting these books together to sell his version of the religion. Now, there are other factions of the church who are really incensed by this and disturbed. Like, okay, this is getting really popular. He's got this cool new collection of books. What do we do with this? And so what they did is they built their own collection of anti-Marcionite texts. So they took some of his stuff, edited it a little bit, added some things that were kind of anti-Marcionite, and built what we now call the New Testament. And so their New Testament is a propagandistic, edited response to his New Testament, which we don't have, right? So Marcion's original New Testament's been completely destroyed. It's lost. We have a lot of quotations and references and descriptions of it, so we can kind of reconstruct maybe what was in it, but we don't have it, right? So our New Testament, yes, was built specifically to win a propaganda war against the original New Testament, which was destroyed, is basically the truth of this.
Don't answer this, but I have to tell you, a joke was in my head when you said Martian, and I thought he would know about Jesus from outer space because he's a Martian. But
yeah, then we get into
it out because it was burning.
Yes, I know. We would get into the Latin and the spelling, but yeah.
Could you talk about Pliny? I think the younger Pliny, who didn't know about. I think he had some idea of who Christians were. Can you talk about the relevance of that?
People often forget. One of the important things, if you're going to do history, one of the most important things you have to look for is what's not being said, right? Rather than just referencing what's being said, look at what's not being said. And because you can learn a lot from that, right? Like what's not in the text. And when we look at Pliny the Younger, now Pliny the Younger is so called because he's the adopted son of, and nephew, biological nephew, but an adopted son of Pliny the Elder, who was a more famous Pliny from earlier. And he features significantly in this saga as well. Although we don't have anything from him about Christians, we should have. That's a whole other side project. But Pliny the Younger's writing in the early 2nd century. And he basically collected all these letters that he would communicate to and from. So he has letters from emperors, but he has letters to the emperor when he was assigned a special governorship to sort of take care of Bithynia, this province. And so he collected it and he published it of all his letters with the emperor. He published all his letters, but the book 10 of his letters is just the emperor stuff, the stuff that he's talking about, the administrative things. And it includes like the letters that he got back from the emperor and the letters that he's writing. And he's talking about, you can learn so much from this about the administration and what the Romans were worried about and how they were dealing with political problems and things like that. But there's one letter in here that's about the Christians. And Pliny writes to Trajan at this time. He writes to Emperor Trajan and he says, hey, look, I got this list, this anonymous list accusing a bunch of people of being Christians. What the hell do I do with these people? Like, I'm vaguely aware that there's Christians and there's something criminal about it, but I don't really know what. I don't know what to punish them for. I don't know what their crimes are. I don't know what they teach. I don't know anything. What do I do with them? And then he goes through, this is what I've done so far. And he says, well, so what I did is I interrogated some of them and tried to figure out what their religion was. And all I heard was a bunch of weird, base, superstitious stuff. Like it was this crazy stuff. And then I tested them by having them pay obeisance to your statue, to your genius, which is the guardian spirit of the emperor, like to pray to that. And some did and some didn't, and the ones that didn't I regarded as traitors and had them killed or sent them off to you for whatever. And but it's clear that Pliny is struggling with what to do. He doesn't know what's wrong with these people. He doesn't know why he's supposed to be prosecuting them. He just says, like, all I know is, like, if they wouldn't, like, basically, if they wouldn't hail Caesar, I got to get rid of them. Like, I don't know why they're being so obstinate. I don't know what their beliefs are or any of this stuff, but that's the thing. The surprising thing, though, is that Pliny, so if you look at his career, Pliny was essentially the equivalent of Attorney General at Rome for many years. He held the highest office, so the equivalent of President of Rome, below Emperor, but the highest office you could hold was Consul. He held that for several years. He was then assigned multiple provinces. So, and his specialty was the law. So, like prosecuting offenders, right? So through multiple provinces from Rome beyond for years and years and years. We're talking like 10, 20 years more. And then in Bithynia, he meets Christians and he says, I've never heard of these. Like I've heard of them, but I don't know anything about them. He says, I've never been at a trial of them. I don't know what they're guilty of, etc. How could Pliny, this guy, of all the people in Rome, how could this guy not know anything about Christians? They can't have been very popular. Like, Christianity had to be extremely scarce, extremely obscure, and other things like they can't have been accused of burning Rome under Nero, because if that were the case, well, Pliny the Younger would definitely know this, because Pliny the Elder, his dad, his beloved adoptive dad, wrote a whole book about the history of the reign of Nero, right? And so he would know about that, right? Like if Nero had persecuted a bunch of Christians for arson, as Tacitus supposedly reports, Pliny the Elder he was an eyewitness. He would have had the best account. In fact, we know Tacitus used Pliny the Elder's book as a source. So he would have described and discussed Christians, and therefore Pliny would know all about Christians. He would know, oh, these are like rioters who burned Rome. Like, I get it. Like, these guys are dangerous motherfuckers, right? No, he has no knowledge of this, right? It doesn't know. So clearly that means Pliny the Elder didn't know anything about Christians. And Pliny the Elder wrote a whole section on the Nero's fire and the who was punished for it and stuff, which means that Pliny the Elder can't have discussed Christians either, which means they were never originally part of the story. So just from Pliny the Younger's silences, the things he doesn't know, the things he doesn't say, and the background knowledge, we can extend that all the way back to Pliny the Elder and say that, well, this legend of Nero persecuting the Christians for burning Rome was clearly a legend that was made up later. It was not true. Otherwise, Pliny the Younger would know about it, and then he doesn't mention it. And for example, we know that, well, that means that Christians were not super popular. There wasn't a ton of them. And Pliny mentions also that there were, most of the Christians, the accused Christians that he talked to, had quit. They'd left the church, some up to 20 years, he says, up to 20 years ago. So we know Christianity was hemorrhaging people. Like, it wasn't a very successful religion at this point. So you can learn all of that from looking at what Pliny says and also what he doesn't say and in the context. And that's why we can get a lot out of that letter.
I don't think we should spend much time on the next question. I don't remember my source, but I remember hearing that Christians, unlike what people think, were not peaceful martyrs, that they were actually criminals.
Yeah, well, so that's a complicated question. The short answer, to give you the short answer, is that it seems very definite, I think, that the Christians were definitely pacifists, right? So they weren't violent. And like I said, there are some scholars who want to argue that they started out as this militant movement, and I don't believe that. I don't think the evidence for that holds up at all. And when you look at Paul, he's very obsessed with a sort of pacifistic mode. When you read the Gospels, they're very obsessed with the pacifistic mode, like saying, no, like we should be like turn the other cheek, like let them beat you, let them enslave you, like it doesn't matter. They're all going to be melted soon, and then you'll get to live forever in heaven. It doesn't matter how much you suffer; it's irrelevant. So don't worry about it, right? This is a very nonviolent movement for sure. But that doesn't mean that they weren't up to stuff, right? So to give you two examples, like one is there are hints in Paul and First Clement that the Christians were very into like creating drama and kind of got each other killed. And the way they would do this is, and there have been scholars who've written articles about this in the studies. It's alluded to in First Clement most plainly, where he says it's the envy of other, like Christians were envying each other as to who had the most attention, who had the most authority, etc. And that somehow this envy was leading to members of the church getting killed. And the way Clement does not explicitly say this, like he doesn't lay it out, but you kind of read between the lines, and it sounds like this, is that there would be this envy between people, authority, position, influence, etc. And so one guy would get another guy killed by outing him to the authorities or framing him for a crime he didn't commit or something like that. Basically like using lawfare, right? Like trying to get the authorities to kill them for some other bullshit reason. And so it wasn't really like the authorities weren't really after the Christians. This is one thing, like Pliny said, like, I don't know what to do with these people. And Trajan wrote back, said, leave them alone. And that seems to be the general tenor, is like, don't bother with them unless they become a nuisance, right? But the Christians themselves would try to get each other killed over this sort of jockeying for power and influence. And, sometimes they get themselves thrown, like look at the letter of Pliny, where he says, some of these people were so obstinate, I had to kill them. He doesn't really care about their religion. It's not because of their religion. It's just, well, that's treason. If you're not going to hail Caesar, you're a rebel, I guess. I got to get rid of you. I can't let that stand, right? And so you could see how a Christian could get another Christian killed by throwing him into a court and to where he's going to be tested and not pass because of their weird idolatry commandments. And just on the understanding that, that'll get that guy out of my way, right? And so, like, they have this sort of, like, almost mafia behavior among early Christians. So it's not, like, outright violence. It's more conniving than that. And of course you would say, like, I'm sure it was only a minority of Christians doing this, but some of them were doing it. It seems quite plain. And you see that, like, as you go into the later sources and so on, that there was a lot of this sort of behavior. And the other thing to talk about in terms of Christian, quote-unquote, illegality is that what Pliny makes clear in his letter is that the Christians did not have a license to assemble. And I think people take that for granted now, that they forget that there's an amendment in the Constitution in the U.S. that says it has the right to assemble. Well, why is that there? That's there because that right didn't exist before, right? Like, it used to be the government, if you assemble, the government just assumes you're conspiring against the government, so they would just come in and beat the hell out of everybody or kill them or whatever, right? Like, assembly, like any kind of assembly was considered a politically challenging act, right? Like, I don't know why these people are assembling, this isn't good. So you had to have a license from the state. And this goes all the way back to the ancient Rome. You had to have a license from the state to assemble for whatever purpose. And that includes, like, the Jewish synagogue. So when the Jews got to assemble for their synagogue services, they had to have a license from the state to do it. And we have another letter in Pliny where he talks about firehouses, like firefighters, right? So to fight fires in cities, you had what are called basically clubs. They were firefighter clubs, basically just like what we have now. You have a firefighter house. They live in there. They share meals together. A fire breaks out. They all scramble and bring the fire equipment and fight it. Well, in Bithynia, in the whole region, but in Bithynia as well, there was a recent rebellion, relatively recent rebellion, not that recent, but relatively enough, that the emperors had a stay on licenses. They said, no licenses, we're not letting anybody assemble because these motherfuckers rebel too much, right? And Pliny says, hey, look, this is causing a problem because cities are burning down. Like, we can't fight fires because you don't allow licenses for fire departments to assemble, like not even fire departments to assemble. He says, can I just issue licenses for that? And Trajan comes back and says, no, like, that's how hardcore they were at that point. Due to their recent unruliness, we don't trust them. So no, they don't get to have firefighters. But that tells us, like, the right to assemble required a license. and that all religions are that way, and everything, and so on. So the question is, like, why did the Christians not just seek a license? When they were Jewish Christians, they could ride under the Jewish license, right? Basically claim to be Jewish, you're covered by the license. But when you have Gentile Christians, and it's clear Pliny's dealing with Gentile Christians, he has no knowledge that these are any connection to Judaism when he's dealing with it. They were clearly assembling extra legally, like they weren't getting the license. They were doing it in secret, and that the government doesn't like that. Why are you assembling in secret? Why are you not seeking a license? And so that looks like treason, and so etc. And that's why Pliny treated it that way. So technically, you could say like they were outlaws in the sense that they were assembling, and it wasn't because they were Christian. This is the thing that Christian apologists get wrong. In their mythology, it was the Romans didn't like Christians. They didn't like Christianity. The Romans didn't give a shit about Christianity. They didn't care about their religion. They didn't care about who they worshipped or how they worshipped or any of that. All they cared was, do you have a license to assemble? And are you assembling in secret? And if you're assembling in secret, we're worried about that because we don't like that. And so that's what Pliny prosecutes them under, is the right to assembly, the non-right to assembly. It's like, you're assembling without a license. That looks like treason. We're going to kill you for that. I really don't care about your superstitious reasons for it. Like, it wasn't relevant to Pliny. And I don't think it was relevant to the Romans at all. And so there's a sense in which that's illegal. Of course, we today would say that the Romans are the ones on the illegal side on that, right, in terms of moral law, because people should have the right to assemble. But that is, nonetheless, there was sort of that criminality among Christians. But that's not the same thing as saying that they were violent people or that they lit cities on fire or anything like that.
Could you talk about heaven not being a dimension, how the ancients believed that this was a physical place and it had 7 layers, and hell was one of them?
Yeah, it's so funny that it took me a while to realize I had to explain this. Ancient historians, like historians of antiquity today, take this for granted, but a lot of people don't know about this. So, okay, so modern Christians, you think Christians today, they think of heaven as another plane of existence. It exists. It's not located in our space-time. You have to go to another universe or another reality or something. It's like a parallel universe. It's not, you can't see it with a telescope. You can't get there with a rocket. That's super modern. That idea did not exist in antiquity at all. There was no concept of other planes of existence or anything like that. Everything was contained within one physical reality. Heaven was a place you could see with a telescope. You could get there with a rocket. They didn't know about rockets, but there's an author named Lucian who came up with a fictional story where people sailed to the moon on a space boat. So it's like the first space voyage, right? But they understood the concept that you could go to the heavens if you had an angel fly you, or if you had a spell that you could cast that could cause you to fly, or you could have a magic boat that could fly, or you had a magic horse that could fly. If you could fly, you could get up to heaven, like it was physically there. You could see it, and if it's so far away you can't see the particulars, but you know it's there. So yeah, their idea of heaven was the physical heaven, and of course most people were geocentric. There were some heliocentrists, but they were considered atheists generally. It's a whole other story as to why that is, but most people were geocentric. So the Earth was a sphere. Most people understood that Earth was a sphere, and it had concentric circles of heavens around it. And each concentric circle had a planet that rotated within it. So like the moon was one, the sun was another, and then you had Venus, Mars, etc. And they knew it as far as Neptune, right? So this is each planet represents something. And beyond Neptune was the stars. So the final heaven, the greatest heaven, was where the stars were. So if you see the stars, that's where God lives, because God lives in the 7th highest heaven, the greatest heaven. And their idea was the higher you go, the more perfect the world is. And the lower you go, the more corrupt and imperfect. And the Earth was the worst. It was like the nastiest, most mortal, terrible place to be. You get up to the moon, and that's the barrier. You get past that, you're in the first heaven. And then there's no longer death and stuff. But it's still not totally perfect. But you keep going up, and it's more and more and more majestic, more and more perfect. So yeah, their idea of the world was like that. Like it was this physical, you all inhabited the same cosmos. Angels were space aliens that lived up there. You could see them if you had a telescope, right? If they had the concept of a telescope, they would understand, oh, maybe I could see aliens. Angels, they would say, but we would say aliens. That was the reality back then. And when you see that, like everything, whenever you see them talking about the heavens, whenever you see them talking about things like that, it changes your perspective on what they're talking about. So when Paul says that we're going to be raptured up into the air. Literally, it says air, which is the atmosphere, which is the firmament, which is the whole sphere below the moon, to meet Jesus in the air. Well, that's because Jesus was just above the moon and flew down, right, to come meet us. We're going to meet everybody halfway, basically. It's all a physical cosmos. And when you understand it that way, it really changes your perspective on how early Christians understood their world, how they understood heaven and hell, for example. I mean, Plutarch talks about hell being on the moon. Paul, I think, didn't believe in hell at all. But Paul, I think, was an annihilationist. I think when the unsaved died, they stayed dead. They never came back to life. But even the Christians, look at Book of Revelation, for example. In Revelation, there is no hell either. What Revelation talks about is that God will create this lake of fire that he'll throw all the bad people and the devil and all the bad angels in. But that's going to happen in the future, and it's a destruction. Like they're just gonna melt in there. It's gonna be like that's it, right? That somehow evolved over time into an underworld that was burning, that the devil ruled. But that didn't exist when the Christians started. They didn't have any idea of this underworld. There was no underworld for them. There was no devil ruling it. The devil lived in the sky. Like he was interrupting and interfering with the world from the sky in his sky castles. He had like castles in the clouds and stuff like that. They didn't have this idea of the devil ruling a fiery underworld. Like that was a later development, much later. It wasn't a part of early Christianity.
I was going to ask this question later, but I think this is a good time to talk about the title of the book, Jesus from Outer Space.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, it sounds ridiculous. You can even address the camera there to talk about why you called it that and how you're not going to change the title.
Yeah, people ask, why did I call the book Jesus from Outer Space? It was to be provocative, that's true, but also because it reflects the reality that it is true. And I think that's the thing, the scandal that we're facing right now is that modern Christians and modern scholars aren't facing this fact that that is how the early Christians understood Jesus. They understood him in the same way that we understand space aliens. He came from outer space. That's literally what they thought. And to like provoke people with that title, it's like, that can't be right. What the hell is this about? But then you go and you read the first chapter where I explain, like, no, this is what they actually thought. They literally believed this. They're using it in the same way. And I'll say to you, Catherine Hetzer recently came out with a chapter, an article, making the same point, saying that their idea, the ancient Jewish and Christian idea of the heavens was outer space. These are space aliens, etc. So I felt very vindicated to see like a major scholar of Judaism saying, yeah, that's how they understood it. And that's true. And I document it with actual evidence as well. So you can get that from there. And that's why it's called that. It's called that to like provoke like Jesus from outer space. What do you mean? Because that's really paradigmatic of how they understood Jesus. And it is very different from modern Christianity, modern understanding. And you will never understand the origins of Christianity if you don't understand it from the mindset of the original Christians. Like you've got to see it from that way. You have to see it as Jesus from outer space because that's how they saw it. So if you want to understand early Christianity and how it originated, you have to see it that way. And so that's why that provocative title draws people in to learn that. And then once you get past that, then your whole mind gets opened. And, oh, wait, we can reinterpret all kinds of things. We can see things differently than we saw them before. And that's, I think, essential to understanding the religion.
Slightly new topic. We don't have to spend much time on this. I didn't learn until I read your books that Moses probably didn't exist either. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's the standard mainstream position now among scholars that the Moses is a mythical figure. More importantly, the Exodus is mythical, which is the idea that if you talk to any mainstream scholar today, they'll tell you the Israelites did not come. They were not from Egypt and escaped and fled and conquered Canaan. They actually were Canaanites. They lived there. They were always there. And so when they came up with this legend of them coming from somewhere else, it was just a mythology they developed to sort of differentiate themselves from other Canaanite tribes that they were actively conquering. So they really were native Canaanites the whole time. They were always in Israel. It wasn't a new place. They were just one tribe that sort of conquered all their surrounding tribes. And that's the historical archaeological reality of Judaism and the Israelites. And so the myth of the Exodus, which was really centered on Moses as the character, Like that was clearly mythological, and this idea has been around since the 70s. In 1970s is when Thomas Thompson first made the case with the archaeology and the textual analysis and all of this. And there was a lot of resistance. People tried to tank his career and things like that. But it prevailed, after, one generation of scholars later, and everybody's like, yeah, that Thomas Thompson guy, he was right. And so that became the mainstream view. And so, yeah, now, like, you can find your Christian apologist here or there who wants to defend Moses, but generally the mainstream consensus is that Moses was mythical.
I also did not know that Judaism was different before the influence of Zoroastrianism. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, this is another thing people don't realize about Judaism is when you look in the Old Testament, you might wonder through most of it, there's barely any concept of an afterlife. There's no resurrection. There's no apocalypse. So none of those things are there. There's no devil per se. Like there's no battle between good and evil deities in a sense. None of that stuff is in there. And yet, by the time Christianity arises, Judaism has adopted all of those beliefs. So now resurrection is a mainstream belief that Christianity is emerging from. Apocalypticism is standard. Messianism, the idea of the Messiah. Messianism, all of these other details. Now, when you look at the history, you find that all of those details were in Persian Zoroastrianism, which was the imperial religion. It was the mainstream religion of Persia at that time. And Persia invaded into the Middle East, took over, Egypt and the Levant and Palestine and all that stuff. And it was the Persians who freed the Jews. So the Jews were put into exile by other forces, the Assyrians and Babylonians. And but when the Persians took over, they had a different way of governing, which was to let independent cultures have their own religions and some sort of autonomy as long as they paid their taxes, right? So like that was their way of governing. And they came up with this idea like, oh yeah, we will even fund the rebuilding of your temple and all this stuff. Just pay us taxes and be good and we'll be happy. That's how we want to rule our subjects. And so after that happened, and we're talking 500s, 400s BC, right? Within about 200 years of that, we see all of most of the Jewish stuff we're looking at has fully incorporated the Persian ideas. So you look in the book of Daniel. Book of Daniel's got the Messiah. It's got the apocalypse. It's got the resurrection of the dead. It's got all of those features and even like the idea of there being an enemy, like a spiritual evil enemy that you had to fight. All of that stuff is in there. And then, of course, it gets even bigger. You look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran texts, like this is all over them. And this is right before Christianity. So you figure like the Persian ideas had leaked into Judaism over a few centuries, and they were just mainstream to the point that no one knew that they came from Persia by the time the Christianity arose. It was just, that's Judaism, right? Like it was not always that way because they would reinterpret other Old Testament texts to verify all of these things. So they would find resurrection in a passage that didn't have it. They would find a Messiah in a passage that wasn't originally written to mean that. They would find the apocalypse in a passage that wasn't originally that. And so that's just the way they read the text. So by the time Christianity arose, no one knew that there was another Judaism. Like that's us today being able to do archaeology, be able to do the textual analysis, the historical analysis. So we can see pre-Persian influence, post-Persian. We can see the changes. And so we know that now. Back then they were blind to it. So that we have this assumption that that's what Judaism is, like resurrection of the dead. That's fundamental to Judaism, right? No, not in the Torah at all, right? That's not in there. That is a Persian influenced idea.
Could you talk about the anti-Semitism in Christianity, starting with the name Judas?
Yeah. That's a complicated subject, isn't it? So in a sense, like some of the anti-Semitism in the New Testament is really anti-Jewish elitism, not anti-Semitism. But by the Middle Ages, it was being spun out in defense of full-on anti-Semitism. Now, there is some full-on anti-Semitism in the New Testament. Most particularly, you look at, there's an interpolation in 1 Thessalonians 2, and then you can look at 2 Thessalonians that backs that up in a way that backs up the same sentiments. Where you see this full-on idea of, oh no, the Jews are just evil and they killed the Lord and God's going to destroy them all and it's just the Gentile Christians who are going to get rewarded. That idea started to arise in the 2nd century for sure, and within Christianity. So full-on anti-Semitism. Part of that is driven by the 2 Jewish wars. So you have the one in the 60s AD, and then you have another one under Hadrian in the 130s. And by that point, the Jews were basically on Rome's shit list, so that it became the enemy of my enemy is my friend scenario, so that Gentile Christianity could sort of protect itself by becoming anti-Semitic. So like being more anti-Jew, like, no, it's those guys are terrible, would get the Romans off their back, right? Like that was the idea. But then, of course, it got worse and worse and worse. And then by the Middle Ages, you have like pogroms and stuff, and like it, full on. But it really did grow out of this need of the Christians to separate themselves from Jews because of the political situation. And that they built on the sort of anti-Jewish elitism, so being opposed to the Jewish elite. So like the criticism of the Jewish elite became criticism of the Jews altogether. And you'd mentioned Judas, so we get back to that. So this starts with Mark, right? You can look in Paul and you can tell that there's no Judas. I mean, he says the 12 saw Jesus after his death, so there's no Judas, right? There's no suicide, there's no betrayer. When Paul talks about betrayal, he actually uses the word that means handed over, and he means God. When God handed Jesus over, it's not when Jesus was betrayed. So there's no Judas in Paul. Mark invented it, and you can tell that Judas, which is Judah, Judah is the country Judah, right? Like, so there was Judah and Israel were at war with each other. That's in the Old Testament, right? Israel was split between 2 kingdoms. It was originally united, supposedly, mythically, and split between Judah and Israel. Judah got wiped out early. Israel got wiped out after that. And so there was this sort of legendary narrative of Judah as the bad guys. Like those are the bad Jews. And yet, when Judea gets created as a province by the Romans, that's Judah, right? That's the name. They chose that name. And so that became symbolic of Jews generally. Like if you could say the word Judean and the word Jew were the same word, right? Like they were indistinguishable, really. So when you have a character in there who's Judah, who betrays basically the representative of Israel, because, Jesus is the representative of Jacob. Jacob is Israel. It's this whole symbolism. So you've got Judah versus Israel right there in the story, just like the Old Testament, right? The two different Jewish nations against each other. And so you have this idea of, oh yeah, of course, the Jews, there's always someone who betrays the bad Jews who betray the good Jews. It's such a common narrative. It's even in our scriptures. Then that's the kind of narrative of the idea of, and who is he conniving with? The Jewish elite. What was he conniving for? Money, right? Like this whole idea of the Jewish elite is all about money. It doesn't care about God or righteousness and stuff. And this started as an internal critique, Jews critiquing other Jews. But once you forget the original context, you can treat it as, oh no, it's just an attack on the Jews. No, it's just the Jews like money. Oh no, it's just the Jews are betrayers. It's just the Jews that are baddies, right? Like, so if you forget the context of what the argument started as, it can become this full-on Gentile anti-Semitic point of view, and of course that's what led to Nazism and the whole thing. So that's the story of that. But it began when in Mark it wasn't anti-Semitic; it was Jews critiquing other Jews, basically.
I remember early on there were some major newscasters, who defended that Jesus was a man. I forgot what raised the argument, but they said that there were writings of him in Josephus and Plutarch. Could you talk? Not Plutarch. He wrote the histories. Tacitus and right. Josephus. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. You could deep dive that. I have 2 things to say about Tacitus and Josephus. Now, first of all, they're very late. So Josephus is writing late 90s or mid 90s, late 90s AD. Tacitus about 20 years later. By this time, at least 1, if not 2, Gospels are already in circulation. So, and neither of these authors say anything that we don't have, say anything about Christianity that we don't have from the Gospels. So, as far as we know, they're just repeating what they heard, which is what the Gospels say. So we can't use them as evidence for the historicity of Jesus because they're not independent, or at least we can't establish that they had any independent sources. They don't mention researching this. They don't mention confirming it or anything. It's what the Christians say. Okay, it's ridiculous that we like ridiculous things, so we're going to report that. That's one point that I make, which is like those passages don't really help us for reconstructing Christianity because they're too late, too derivative. The other thing is that there's actually a lot of really good evidence that they never wrote those things. Tacitus, the passage in Tacitus, I think the evidence is really strong that he was writing about Messianic Jews who were followers of Chrestus, this particular Jewish rioter, Messianic Jew in Rome. So under Claudius. So it's not even the right period. It's not even the right city. This is a completely different guy. Like the names are similar, Christus. But Suetonius says that Chrestus was in Rome starting riots himself under Claudius, and that's well after Pontius Pilate was dead. So that's definitely not our guy, right? And if you read Tacitus without the one sentence that has, "Oh, this is the Christ that was killed by Tiberius," if that sentence isn't there, then you see the whole passage is about the Christians, not the Christians. It's about this particular subsect of Messianic Jews who were very riotous. And then it makes total sense that Tacitus would say, oh, they would be scapegoated for the fire. Some of them even confessed, he says, to burning Rome. So that actually might have been the Christians, causing issues and, another riot in service of their Messianic views. But that wouldn't have been the Christians. But a later Christian commentator may have written in the note, oh, is this Christ that they're talking about? And then later scribe might have integrated that into the text, etc. But there's a lot of evidence to show that attributing that story to the Christians did not exist at that time, because the 2nd century Christians, they've never heard of it. We have whole stories and discussions from them about the Neronian persecution, and all they've heard of is that Nero supposedly killed Paul and Peter. They have no knowledge of the fire. They have no knowledge of masses of Christians being persecuted for it. It just doesn't exist as anything. When we get to the 4th century, someone forged a bunch of letters between Paul and Seneca, this famous philosopher of the period. So a bunch of these fake letters. And in one of those, Seneca, I think, mentions that, there were these Jews who were scapegoated for the fire, and some Christians got swept up in that, right? And that seems to have started the idea, maybe it was Christians. And then so someone may have said, maybe this Tacitus passage is about Christians. And so they edited the Tacitus passage, and it became about Christians. And that's how we ended up with that. So there's a lot more evidence for this. I'm just being very brief. But it looks like Tacitus never mentioned Christ as a figure in this original text. So that gets rid of Tacitus. So if you look at Josephus, there's 2 passages that you could go into 2 different discussions about the 2 of them. But one of them is this little paragraph. It's just a fawning propagandistic advertisement for Jesus. It doesn't sound like Josephus at all. It doesn't follow his discourse style. It doesn't follow his vocabulary style. It's completely non-Josephine. And so there's a lot of argument. And it wasn't known to Origen, the scholar who scoured Josephus looking for things. He couldn't find this passage. Doesn't mention it. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting that this passage was also inserted. Someone wrote it. Scholars have shown that it's based on the Gospel of Luke. So whoever wrote it was using the Gospel of Luke as a guide text. And built it. And it looks like Christian creeds. We have a lot of these Christian creeds that Christians built. So it looks like a Christian text that got inserted into Josephus. It was never there originally. And so on. You could go down the line. And so that's the other way of looking at this, is that these guys never wrote about this. This was basically Christian meddling and doctoring of texts later.
Were Lucifer and Satan the same character?
No, this is one I don't know the answer to. So all I can tell you is this. Satan is an early figure. We find him in the Old Testament. The word is more of an office than a name. So it means the adversary or opponent, the opposer. There was a role in ancient kingly courts assigned to someone, like their job was to argue with the sovereign, right? So the sovereign says, I'm thinking this. And so their job, they'd be permitted to say, I'm going to argue against you, so that you have someone to bounce the idea off, so that you can be more sure of your position or change your ideas or whatever. And that was called the adversary. So it was actually an office. And when the Jews built their theology, they built God out of these ideas, the kingly courts of the time. Like God acts exactly like an ancient despot. His court is organized exactly the same way as an ancient despot, and so on. And so that having adversary. So originally in the Old Testament, you look at the book of Job, Satan is one of God's henchmen, essentially. Like he's not an enemy of God. He's in heaven. He's doing God's will. When Job is getting like horribly, him and all his family are getting horribly murdered or diseased or whatever. It's God said, Satan, go do all this for me and to do this bet, because they have this bet between each other as to whether he'll break or not, because God's a bastard in the Bible. So that's Satan originally, and then sometime after the close of the canon of the Old Testament, well, the canon doesn't really get closed until much later, but until the last book that is in the canon now, which would be Daniel, but Daniel doesn't really talk about Satan much. But sometime between that and Christianity, Judaism had adopted this idea of an enemy of God. So we see this in the book of Enoch, the Watchers and Samael, and these particular, like this one angel leads this war in heaven, he's kicked out, etc. And he and his legion of evil angels go inhabit the sky and earth, and then they go and have sex with earthly women and teach them witchcraft and all this horrible stuff. That's all post-biblical, right? So the Old Testament doesn't have that because our Old Testament doesn't include any of those books that tell that story, the sort of change in status of Satan. Now the question is there's a lot of different names being thrown around. Like, so when did Samael become Satan? Like, when were they the different people, and then they were assumed to be the same person? And if so, when did that happen? You've got that with Lucifer. You've got that with the serpent, right? The serpent in Genesis is not Satan. He's literally just the serpent, right? And so, but later, by the time Christianity comes along, he's assumed to be Satan in disguise, okay? But when did that happen? We don't know, because we don't have a really reliable chronological record of these ideas. So we can't trace, it's hard to trace, let's say, where these ideas all came from, when they started getting associated with each other. And I haven't deep dived that myself, so I couldn't tell you when. So Lucifer is a Latin word. It's Hillel is the original word, it means bringer of light or radiant one or whatever. That appears, I think, in the Dead Sea Scrolls or some of the other early Jewish literature. But we don't know, like, when was that person associated with Satan? Were they always the same person? That I don't know. So there are people probably who have good ideas about this and can talk about them, but that's not my field. So
when I was a teen, I researched crucifixion. I don't know if it's true, but supposedly it was created by the Phoenicians and then perfected by the Romans.
No, that's plausible. I mean, it probably is prehistoric, honestly. But yeah, it's in ancient Sumer already, right? Like for like 2000 BC. So like it's a very old method of abuse.
Well, as an early teen, I discovered that if nails were used, they weren't through the hand; they were through. The source said through the wrist, but then a later source said it wasn't through the bone at all. It was between the two arm bones. That's not really my question. I'm just building up to this. And then there was a Roman coin that showed that the feet were on either side of the post, and there was a nail through the heel bone. But that is not the question. The question is, the crucified person was naked as part of the punishment, and why does Jesus have a loincloth? That's question number one. And number two is, I didn't know until I read your books that the crucified were denied burial, but you talked about a treaty that nullified that. So
yeah.
Whatever whatever questions you get of what I just said.
There's a lot in there. Before the Jewish War, right? So the Jewish War starts in 66 AD. So Christianity's been going for years before this. So when Jesus would have been killed, if there was a Jesus, Judea and the Jews generally were under treaty with Rome because the Jews sided with the right side in the Civil War, like way back. So Julius Caesar, like they sided with Julius Caesar, and so once Caesar sort of consolidated the empire, which was taken over by Augustus, Caesar made a treaty with them, and Josephus talks about and quotes this treaty, and the treaty allows them their laws, basically. So basically, Jews are allowed to be subject to their own laws, essentially. And one of these laws was the burial law. So this idea is like, if someone was killed, they had to be buried before sunset. That was the sacred law. And so that was protected by treaty. Now, normally, normally when you crucify someone, they stay alive for days, right? So, like, that wouldn't apply. So, like, you would nail somebody up, they would stay alive until the next day. Maybe 2 days later, they're dead. Okay, now it triggers the law. So now, okay, they have to be buried before sunset. Now, the Gospels have this weird story where Jesus suddenly dies, weirdly fast, right? And so, clearly fiction. But if that had actually happened, let's speculate, right? If it actually happened that he just, wow, he must have had a heart condition. I don't know. He just died early. The Jewish law would mandate that he would have to be buried immediately, or like before sundown. And Mark correctly depicts this. So he has Joseph of Arimathea approach Pilate and say, "Hey, it's our law. I need to bury this guy." And Pilate says, "Yeah," which he would, because that was the that was the treaty. Pilate was a bit of a bastard, but the emperors kept getting on him to follow the treaty and not violate it. He did violate it a few times, and it got him into trouble. But no, he would, if he was feeling like he was a good guy that day, he would obey the treaty. So yeah, okay, you can take care of this guy. And then the way it's depicted in the story of Mark, Joseph takes him down, but it's too late. Like, there's not enough time. Like, the sun's going down. It's going to be the Sabbath, and you can't do labor, so you can't bury. There's no exception for a few minutes after. There's no 5-minute rule or anything. So so he has to. Then there is a provision. We know in the Tosefta there's a provision, because obviously this must happen a lot. Like, what happens if someone dies 1 minute before sunset? Shit, what do you do then? And there's a provision for that, which is you can temporarily store, if there's not enough time to bury, you can temporarily store the body, and they list various ways that you can do this. One is, if there's a available tomb, you can just throw them in there until the Sabbath is over, which would be the evening of Saturday, right? So like the following evening. Then and maybe you could wait until Sunday morning, right? But you didn't have to. You could, like, as soon as the sun went down Saturday, the Sabbath is over, and now you can do labor, so you can go collect that body and go finish the burial. And so Mark's story is in agreement with all that. It fits that narrative. When you get into some of the later Gospels, they start to get more ridiculous and forget that this was a thing. But I don't know, does that answer your question about the burial law?
I really only wanted to ask about the treaty.
Yeah, the treaty.
I learned
right.
about that in your books.
Yeah,
Everything else was maybe ridiculous.
A bonus. Yeah.
Short question: could you talk about Jesus B, who lived 100 years before Jesus C, supposedly?
Jesus Ben Pantera. Yeah, so the Talmud only knows, it's the Babylonian Talmud, though, so this is the Talmud outside the Roman Empire. The Jews, the rabbis of that, who are writing that text, only know about a Christianity, or only a mention of Christianity, that teaches a Jesus who was stoned to death 100 years before our Jesus. It's clearly the same Jesus there that has all the same, the Jesus of Nazareth, it's all the same, son of Mary, like all of the details. So it's clearly Christianity. And they have their own polemic against it, etc., but they have no knowledge of a Jesus executed by Pontius Pilate. And we have Epiphanius, who mentions a sect called the Nazorians, which we know were the original Torah-observant Christians, because we have that in the book of Acts, and there's hints of it in the way that Matthew talks about. The word Nazareth actually originally was Nazorian. It's not the town. It's some sort of sacred meaning. Script comes from Scripture. But that was the original name for this group of these Torah-observant Christians, or the Nazorians. And Epiphanius talks about them and discusses in the middle of this, he has this digression about where they date Jesus. And they have this idea of the succession. And it was when Alexander Jannaeus died, that's when Jesus officially took over, so that there was an uninterrupted succession of kings, just like to maintain the prophecy, right? So that there would never be a broken line of kings. And Jesus was the last one because he lives forever, so he holds the throne forever, right? That's the Christian teaching. Which is what Nathan promised in 1 Samuel. You read the book, it says, well, Nathan said, like, they're a descendant, basically the child of David will create a line that will never falter, like they'll always, their throne will be forever. And so that's hard to explain, with the destructions of the Assyrians and Babylonians and all that. You have to come up with some sort of maneuvering to get it to up to Alexander Jannaeus uninterrupted. But if you can solve that problem, Jannaeus is the last one, right? That's the end of the throne there. So these Christians said, well, yeah, then Jesus came along and right at the same time. And so this actually, in Jannaeus, is 75 BC. So this is setting Christianity. They're talking about Jesus being alive and being executed in the 70s BC, not the 30s AD. So we have this triangulation. We have evidence of this sect of Christians, probably outside the Roman Empire, who placed Jesus 100 years earlier, and they did not have a crucifixion. They had a stoning. They had a stoning and a hanging of the body, which was by Jewish law, and we know the words are the same. So like the word that we translate as crucifixion or crucified in the Bible, it also refers to this, what's called planking, which is the hanging of the corpse after death. And so, unfortunately, Paul is very vague. And you can actually do the dating of Paul. He could be writing in the 50s BC, talking about a death in the 70s. So Paul is congruent with that dating scheme. So there's some scholars who tried to argue that that's Christianity really started then, and then the Gospels just rebooted it, basically created a new version of the story and put it under Pilate. The alternative is that it was the other way around, that someone outside the empire decided to reboot the Pilate story into a 100-year earlier story. Or they're both bogus, and the ones in the Roman Empire gave it a Roman story, and the ones outside the Roman Empire gave it a Jewish story or Alexander Chenias story. So we don't know.
I took a mythology class, and this is not going to be a big... the question's big, but the answer doesn't have to be big.
Okay.
I learned about the similarities between Dionysus and Jesus. That's also when I learned what a demigod was, half god, half mortal.
Right, yeah.
And I learned all the rules of demigods, the excruciating death, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until your book that I learned about the savior gods and how plentiful they were. And could you talk about what they are, and was Jesus one of these savior gods?
Yeah, I mean, really briefly, your personal savior, right? That's not a Christian innovation. They were late to the game. There were personal saviors everywhere. What had happened is, from the Hellenistic period, let's say from the classical period into the Hellenistic, a lot of these agricultural deities. Now, these agricultural deities were originally associated with agriculture, so they die and rise with the crops, and it's all symbolic of the death and resurrection of the world, right? Like it has that kind of meaning, and it was a collective religion. But in the Hellenistic period, they all became personal religions. They were retooled into personal saviors, so that these agricultural deities became personal resurrected deities. And by basically joining yourself to them through communion and baptism, you were basically guaranteed you're guaranteed a good suite in heaven, right? Like whenever you ended up in Hades or wherever you went, you'd get the good rooms, right? Like you would be well off, right? You'd find the Isle of the Blessed, or you would have a better place. It was a way to get the good place in heaven, essentially. Wherever heaven was, doesn't matter. And so these were all personal saviors, and they were fictive kin groups, so you'd all call each other brother and sister. You would be initiated through a baptism, usually something to do with baptism. There would be regular communion, where you have basically the Lord's Supper, where you're communing with the God and becoming one with the God, and that allowed you to guarantee that whatever happened to the God would happen to you. So this idea of personal saviors was all over the place. There were a ton of them: Osiris, Dionysus, Hercules, Melkart, like you could go on and on. Lots of these fellows, and that had all happened. And you could look and see that each national culture had one, right? Like, so the Syrians had one, the Greeks had one, the Egyptians had one. So Christianity is kind of like the Jews getting one, right? Basically, they were late to the game, but they see everybody else has got a personal savior, and so it looks like they created their own personal savior, essentially. And built it out of Jewish ideas, so it's a very Jewish version. It's not identical to the others, but it has the same role, right? Jesus has the same role. You baptize into Jesus, you have communion with Jesus, you have your fictive kin group, you're all brothers and sisters, and this all guarantees you a better place in the afterlife over everyone else. And so it's very much that model, and Christianity is, like I said, the latecomer. Like it fits this model. It's not the driver of the model, it's the last of them, really.
I want people to read your books. I think they should start with Jesus from Outer Space, and then go deeper with the historicity of Jesus.
I agree.
But you'll get to plug that after this question. Mm-hmm. I thought, after learning about Dionysus and about what was called sparagmos, the excruciating death, and then the demigod becomes a deity, I thought that explained the crucifixion. But you have another explanation regarding blood magic.
Right. Yeah. Well, these aren't incompatible, right? So if you look at every hero's death among the savior cults. And almost all of them have deaths. Mithras, I think, is the only one who doesn't die, but he has some sort of great struggle, a passion, a suffering that he has to go through. But many of the others, Dionysus, Attis, Osiris, even Romulus is not a savior god, but it's similar dying and rising god. Their deaths are all different, right? Like how they die is different. And it's very much in line with the culture they come from, right? Like who are they? What is their culture? Their death kind of fits the cultural and pre-religious logic of that location. So really, it's the death or suffering that is the universal that gets shared. And then when it gets plugged into a particular culture, they build a specific instantiation of that, and it will fit whatever the local culture is. And so when Jesus gets plugged into this, well, what fits their local culture? And it is very much this idea of the blood death, right? The sacrificial blood rite. And you see this, I mean, the legend is, right, that Abraham's going to kill Isaac. That God said, kill him, sacrifice him. And the last minute, God stops him and says, oh, okay, I'll let you substitute an animal. And the legend is that started what's called Yom Kippur. So every year you would slay a lamb. There's a more elaborate ritual, but it ends with the slaying of the lamb, and the blood pours onto the altar, and then God is calmed down and he forgives everyone's sins. But it only lasts a year, so it has a short spell duration, right? So you're basically doing this thing. After a year, God gets angry again, and everybody's sins are still on them. So you do it again, and you kill the animal, and God is calmed down. So basically, it's a 1 year spell duration that you cast every year. And I'm doing this almost literally from Hebrews 9. So if you're really I'm not making this up, but Hebrews 9 explains everything I'm talking about. So it's really blood magic, right? It's this idea that you can get rid of the stain of sin through a spell. It's an elaborate spell magic, the sacrificial blood magic. And Hebrews explains that, well, yeah, that's exactly right. So if you did it backwards, so if you took Isaac and put him back in, like from the animal, rather than substituting the animal for Isaac. So animals are weak tea, right? They're like low power ingredients. But if you put an actual person there, it's way more powerful. And if it's the Son of God, like that's the most powerful blood there could be. So what is the spell duration on that? Well, it's infinity, right? Like that spell lasts forever. You don't have to repeat it every year. It's just a more powerful blood magic. And that's their idea that's why Jesus had to die, is so that he could basically put an end to the Yom Kippur ritual, which does, interestingly, end reliance on the temple cult, and there's a whole political side to this. But the idea is that because Jesus' blood is so much more powerful, it calms God down forever. And so it has an infinite duration. And all you then have to do to benefit from that is join in the death and sacrifice of Jesus spiritually, which you do through baptism and communion, and then you'll share in what he accomplished. And so that's how they replace the temple cult, so that you don't have to have animal sacrifices anymore. That's weak tea blood magic. We had the best blood magic spell ever. It lasts forever. You can even join in after the fact, right? Like it's that powerful a spell. And that's the actual way that they framed it, because that was a very Jewish understanding of what you could do with a human sacrifice that would make sense within their religion.
Well, thank you for your time. Again, I want people to read your books, starting with Jesus from Outer Space. So you can tell this camera everything about your books, your websites, and threaten people if they don't buy your book.
I'll tell you. Definitely Jesus from Outer Space is a fun read. It's a good place to start. And if you really want to get even more deep into the history and the background and why this all makes sense, and a deep analysis of the Gospels and things like that, On the Historicity of Jesus is your next stop. I find people who don't even have to agree with the thesis, it's just useful for a reference book. There's so much to learn from it, and you can use it for so many other things. But I have other books too. So I do philosophy of basically naturalism, humanism. So Sense and Goodness Without God would be my starting point there, where you get into this is what a worldview looks like, an evidence-based worldview, and what you can do with it, and so on, and how we can answer the Christians and all these other questions. So I think that's an important book. And then after that, you go looking at the things I've done. I've got 2 books on ancient science that I think it's one of my most favorite subjects. So you can learn things that you never knew about that. And I still, in both of those, touch on Christianity and its difference between the pagans in regards to science and the scientific mindset and why that matters for history. etc., and various other books. So if you go to my website, richardcarrier.info, you can click on the books menu, and you'll see all the books that I've written, as well as chapters in books. I've got lots of that. But also on my blog, I'm always happy to have Patreon supporters fund my blog, which is ad-free and not paywalled. And so everybody in the world can see it. This is the benefit of supporting me and supporting my work through my blog, is that everybody can read it around the world. And that includes people in Egypt, people in Iran, and so on. Plus other things. So check it out. I teach online classes, and you can hire me to do stuff. You can all find all of that out and follow and find my social media at richardcarrier.info. And so that's just my name, richardcarrier.info.
Forgot one thing. Other interviews have you talk about your credentials, and I think we should get to the subject and then talk about your credentials. So now tell the viewer that you're not the kind of guy who came up with the Flavian conspiracy. Like, what makes what makes you an expert?
Talking to you?
You can talk to either me or the camera.
Yeah, I'll talk to you. No, so, gosh, what I started, so I was a graduate student at Columbia University, where I got my PhD in ancient history. And at the time, when I was working on my PhD, my thesis, at that time, I was a hardcore historicist. Like, I was really annoyed by mythicists and was constantly like criticizing them harshly, even sometimes. And that includes the crazy ones, like the Roman emperor's conspiracy to invent Christianity and all of that. It's nonsense. But when I ran into I was very hostile to this idea, and so certain people then started asking me to say, like, you should read Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle. And they said that he's not like that. He's not arguing a conspiracy theory. He has better arguments. He has a different theory, and it looks good, and we're not experts, so we want your opinion. Does this, as an expert yourself, does this hold up? And I said, all right. And ultimately, through various stages of things, it resulted in my final study, and which was on the historicity of Jesus, which was basically a funded postdoctoral research project. That led me to be convinced by basically the Doherty thesis. I think it needed to be stripped down, like some of the claims gotten rid of, but overall his point holds up. And it's a very different theory than you get from the popular internet stuff.
Well, I just wanted people to know that you're not a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, right.
A lot of these outlandish ideas that you actually researched.
Yes, and I was an unbeliever, right? Like, so I didn't buy mythicism until I read Doherty, and I was like, well, I haven't seen a good argument against it. And then I did my own research and found, and I mean real research, right? Like massive library, PhD level research, and came to the conclusion that the thesis holds up. So I was actually surprised by that. And that's also another thing that's different. There are a lot of mythicists who are kind of like angry ex-Christians. And like they were lied to their whole life, and so it's natural for them to assume that, well, then the existence of Jesus is just another lie, right? Like, why should I believe any of it? I didn't come there that way. Like, I was a full-on atheist, hardcore, published, arguing atheist, who believed, yeah, Jesus is just a historical guy, but he got mythologized and legendized, and it's like any other religious founder. So yeah, I was completely comfortable with a historical Jesus and was vehemently defending a historical Jesus. And I was only convinced by the evidence. And in the end, I will point out that I don't think it's a way to argue against Christianity. I don't think you would say, like, well, Christianity is false because Jesus didn't exist. Because I think the evidence is too weak for that kind of argument. It's easier to, like, you could say that Jesus wasn't supernaturally resurrected from the dead. Like, the evidence for that is way, way stronger, right? So if you want to argue against Christianity, there's a lot of way better arguments than Jesus didn't exist. So I don't use it that way, and I don't think it's a good argument against Christianity. I find it interesting because I want to understand how the religion formulated and how it got started and how it evolved. And I think it's really important that historians have been so stuck on the faith doctrine that Christians have been selling, that they're missing the boat on what really happened, how Christianity really began, how it really evolved, what the texts of the Gospels really mean. I mean, this idea of looking at as I mentioned before, the fig tree as a symbol for the temple cult, that, like, look at every single passage that way, you're going to get way more out of the text. You're going to find out what the authors really meant. Whereas if you're trying to dig historical facts out of these gospels, you're missing the point entirely, and you're wasting your time essentially. So as a historian, I find it important, but I don't see it as like this something that you can bludgeon Christians with. This idea, I just think it's important. Like, once you've gotten rid of Christianity, now you can look at this question objectively. You don't have to believe that Jesus existed. Now you can ask the question, well, wait a minute, what if he didn't? Then how do we interpret the Gospels? Then how do we interpret these passages in Paul? Then how did the religion begin? Then you can start asking the real questions that we really should be asking, and there are good answers for them, I think.
Well, once again, I have to tell people to read your books because I already had my ideas, and I didn't need to validate my ideas or to find contradictions to my ideas. I was compelled to read by watching your lectures, and you talked about things outside of the argument.
Right.
And I learned a lot about the people of the time and the way things worked, and that was fascinating to me. So it's not something to read and become angry.
Yeah.
But that leads to my, I guess, a bonus question. I've seen some people in the question and answer period look very angry. I wonder if you've ever received death threats or had a problem.
I have not. That partly, I'm sure that's because I'm a man, so I have a bit of male privilege. But no, I mean, I don't really. It's funny, way earlier, when I was an editor for the Secular Web, and this is the 90s, right? Way back then, I got a lot of "you're going to hell" stuff, like a lot of emails, "you're going to burn in hell," yada yada. I almost never get even that, right? And that's not even the same thing as like, "I know where you live," that kind of stuff. No, the answer is I don't really, and I'm not entirely sure why. I get a lot of lies and propaganda about me, so like I get slandered a lot in public. Like, that's how people attack me. I think people have gotten the impression that like threatening to kill me wouldn't be worth the bother. like it's not going to affect me, right? Like I think people get the sense that would just, like, it's just they try to hurt me in other ways, right? Than that. Like, I don't think they think that is going to be very effective.
They don't want to make a martyr out of you.
Also, that could be too, right?